Unraveling the Machinations of Power, a critical examination of global exploitation. The scenario described encapsulates a grim reality where arrogance and exploitation have entrenched themselves in the fabric of global affairs, leaving a trail of devastation and inequality in their wake. From Africa to the Middle East, the echoes of colonialism reverberate, perpetuating systems of oppression and subjugation. In this essay, we critically examine the historical and contemporary dimensions of global exploitation, shedding light on the entrenched power dynamics that continue to shape our world. The legacy of colonialism looms large over Africa, where centuries of exploitation and disregard for indigenous cultures have left deep scars. Despite gaining independence, many African nations still grapple with the remnants of colonial rule, as evidenced by the persistent socio-economic disparities and political instability. The French colonization of Africa serves as a poignant example, with African nations treated as mere pawns in the pursuit of economic gain. Even decades after decolonization, the French continued to exert control, treating Africans as second-class citizens and perpetuating systems of inequality. Similarly, the Middle East bears the brunt of Western exploitation, particularly in the realm of oil politics. For decades, Western powers have manipulated regional dynamics to secure access to oil reserves, often at the expense of local populations. The case of Aramco, with its partial ownership by the United States, exemplifies this exploitation, as Western interests continue to profit from the region's resources while neglecting the needs and aspirations of its people. In Turkey, the insidious influence of external actors is palpable, as evidenced by the manipulation of leadership and suppression of dissent to maintain control over strategic resources. The orchestrated plane crash to eliminate Turkey's nuclear energy team underscores the lengths to which powerful interests will go to safeguard their dominance. Behind these machinations lie elite families like the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds, whose vast wealth and influence afford them unparalleled control over global affairs. Yet, amidst this bleak landscape, glimmers of hope emerge in the form of grassroots movements and calls for genuine revolution. The 2024 uprisings in Africa signal a collective awakening to the injustices perpetuated by entrenched power structures, while movements for social justice and equality gain momentum worldwide. However, achieving meaningful change requires more than just sporadic protests. It demands a concerted effort to dismantle the systems of oppression that enable the elite to maintain their stranglehold on power. In conclusion, the scenario described serves as a stark reminder of the enduring legacy of exploitation and inequality in our world. From colonialism to contemporary geopolitics, the pursuit of power and profit often comes at the expense of human dignity and justice. As we confront these realities, it is imperative that we unite in a common struggle for genuine revolution, challenging the hegemony of the elite and forging a path towards a more equitable and just world. The paradox of Africa's wealth juxtaposed with the pervasive poverty and suffering of its people is a testament to the depths of exploitation and injustice that have plagued the continent for centuries. Despite boasting some of the world's richest deposits of underground minerals and precious metals, Africa remains mired in poverty, hunger, and misery. This tragic reality underscores the insidious legacy of colonialism and ongoing exploitation by Western powers. Historically, Africa's vast resources were plundered by European colonizers in a relentless pursuit of wealth and power. The scramble for Africa in the 19th and early 20th centuries saw European powers carve up the continent, exploiting its people and resources for their own enrichment. The extraction of natural resources, from gold and diamonds to oil and minerals, fueled the industrial revolutions of Europe while leaving African nations impoverished and ravaged. Even after the end of formal colonial rule, the exploitation of Africa's resources persisted, albeit in different forms. Western corporations, often in collusion with corrupt local elites, continued to exploit Africa's wealth, extracting resources at minimal cost while reaping enormous profits. The terms of trade were often skewed in favor of Western interests, further impoverishing African nations and perpetuating a cycle of dependency and underdevelopment. In recent decades, the phenomenon of resource curse has become increasingly apparent in many African countries. Despite abundant natural resources, these nations have failed to translate their wealth into prosperity for their people. Instead, corruption, mismanagement, and external interference have hindered development efforts, leaving millions of Africans trapped in poverty and deprivation. The plight of African miners provides a stark illustration of this exploitation. Whether digging for diamonds in Sierra Leone or cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo, these miners toil under dangerous conditions for minimal wages, while Western corporations reap enormous profits from the sale of these precious commodities. Meanwhile, the wealth generated from Africa's resources often flows out of the continent, enriching foreign investors and perpetuating economic inequality. Moreover, the environmental impact of resource extraction further exacerbates the suffering of African communities. Deforestation, water pollution, and habitat destruction degrade the land and threaten the livelihoods of indigenous peoples, exacerbating the cycle of poverty and environmental degradation. In the face of such systemic injustice, the question arises: why does Africa continue to suffer while its resources enrich others? The answer lies in the entrenched power structures that perpetuate inequality and exploitation. Western governments and corporations, often aided by corrupt local elites, wield disproportionate influence over African economies, dictating terms and extracting wealth for their own gain. To break free from this cycle of exploitation, Africa must assert control over its resources and challenge the hegemony of external actors. This requires transparent governance, responsible resource management, and equitable distribution of wealth. It also necessitates international solidarity and support for African nations in their struggle for economic independence and social justice. Ultimately, the plight of Africa serves as a stark reminder of the enduring legacy of colonialism and the ongoing struggle for justice in a world marked by profound inequalities. Until Africa's wealth is harnessed for the benefit of its people rather than foreign interests, the continent will continue to languish in poverty and misery, a stark testament to the failures of global capitalism and the imperative of collective action for a more just and equitable world. In 2024, the reverberations of the latest revolutions in Burkina Faso send shockwaves throughout France and other Western nations with vested interest in Africa. The scenes of mass protests, calls for political change, and the ousting of long-standing regimes strike fear into the hearts of French policymakers and business leaders. For decades, France has maintained a strong presence in its former colonies, wielding significant influence over their economies, politics, and natural resources. However, the tide of change sweeping across Burkina Faso threatens to upend the status quo and disrupt France's grip on the region. The panic in France stems from the realization that the era of unchecked French influence in Africa may be coming to an end. As Burkina Faso undergoes a political awakening, other African nations could follow suit, challenging the dominance of Western powers and demanding greater autonomy and self-determination. This prospect terrifies French policymakers, who fear losing access to Africa's vast resources and markets, as well as their strategic foothold on the continent. Moreover, the specter of Russia and China looms large over France's fears. As Burkina Faso and other African nations seek new partners and allies, there is a growing concern that Russia and China will step in to fill the void left by the retreat of Western powers. Both countries have been expanding their influence in Africa in recent years, offering investment, infrastructure projects, and military cooperation in exchange for access to resources and geopolitical influence. For France, the prospect of being supplanted by these emerging powers is a nightmare scenario that threatens its economic interests and geopolitical standing. In response to the unfolding crisis in Burkina Faso, French policymakers scramble to devise a strategy to protect their interests in Africa. They may resort to diplomatic pressure, economic incentives, or even covert intervention to maintain their influence and counter the rise of rival powers. However, the reality is that the ground is shifting beneath France's feet, and old methods of control may no longer suffice in the face of growing popular discontent and geopolitical competition. Ultimately, the panic in France reflects a broader reckoning with the changing dynamics of power in Africa and the world. The latest revolutions in Burkina Faso signal a new era of African agency and assertiveness, challenging the entrenched dominance of Western powers and opening the door to new players on the global stage. As France grapples with the prospect of losing its grip on Africa, the question remains: will the party be over for French neo-colonialism, or will it find new ways to maintain its influence in a rapidly changing world?